Thank you for joining Literally Alive. My name is Robert Diamante. Agnes Bushell is a writer and editor, the recipient of 2 main literary awards, and professor emerita in liberal arts at the Maine College of Art and Design. She's also the co-founder of Littoral Books. Agnes is the author of The House on Perry Street, The Oracle Pool, and Monkey. Tonight, we celebrate Agnes Bushell's Verity and Perpetua, a novel in 6 acts set in Elizabethan England. Peggy Shaffer is a retired professor of history, global and intercultural studies, and environmental studies at Miami University. She will join Agnes for an hour of lively conversation that will be wide-ranging. Welcome, Agnes and Peggy.
Thank you.
And now I will have the help of Marcia Brown, also co-founder of Littoral Books, who will read along with me an excerpt from the novel. Well, well, that was a very fine gallop of verses. Never was I so berhymed.
Hello, you have bestirred us.
Begrudge me not, beloved youths. I was beguiled.
Guiled, but not, I trust, besotted.
Besotted, bemused, and a bit bedraggled.
Better be draggled than benighted.
No night can be where your voice alighted.
Oh, I fear you flatter where'er you might.
Whoever loved that loved not at first sight?
What is love made of? Tell me, Sir Knight.
Love is made of hope and care.
It is made of faith and prayer.
It is made of sighs and tears.
It is made of joys and fears.
Love is made of adoration.
Of passion and observation.
It is made of purity and...
Oh, peace, peace, no more of this. 'Tis like the howling of Irish wolves against the moon.
Bravo.
You guys were great.
That's fantastic. So as you guys can see, Verity and Perpetua is an adventurous book. It's about 2 young women who meet in Elizabethan England, Europe, in a convent, and then begin an adventure into the world of literature, playwriting, finding themselves, finding lovers. It's a lovely book. And so I'd like to begin this conversation with Agnes. So I'm a historian, and when historians begin to develop a project, they go to the archives or they get engaged in some historical debate, or they follow what their thesis advisor tells them to write about. It seems like writing fiction is a very different process. And I know, Agnes, I've talked to you a lot about, how do your books come to you? So how did this story come to you, and how did it evolve in the writing process?
Well, that's a big question, Peggy. Thank you. How did you do this? So before this book, the book that was right before this book is called Monkey. And what I did with Monkey was I was trying to write a book about my son, and I couldn't write it in the present. So I had to move the whole story to the 19th century and to Russia. And that was the only way that I could tell the story. So for a very long time, I've been trying to write a book about myself and my best friend from high school. And I had written several books, which were not published, thank goodness, about this relationship. And I couldn't get it right. I just couldn't figure out how to do it. And so after the experience with Monkey, I thought, well, maybe I can tell this story if I just move the whole kit and caboodle into another century. And the story I wanted to tell was, as you said, the story of a friendship. And a friendship that had intense, almost, I don't know, sort of an intensity about it that was almost too much for them to deal with, right? And there were certain things about this relationship that I wanted to bring along to this other century, whichever century I decided it was going to be. One thing was that we wrote plays. So I wanted to make sure that that playwriting element was there. The other thing was that we didn't speak in rhymes like Verity and Perpetua do, but we did talk a lot. So there was a lot of repartee, and I wanted to be able to move that into this other world. Then it was just a question of what century I was going to move them into.
Yeah.
And that
So
was-
did you play around with different moments? I mean, did you know you were gonna put it in the Elizabethan era from the start, or did you?
No, actually, I thought initially it would be the 17th century. Because I wanted them to be playwrights. I thought of Alpha Ben particularly, who was the first woman to actually produce a play in her own name.
Mhm.
And so Alpha Ben is a restoration playwright. So then I did a lot of research about the 17th century and tried to figure out where I could squeeze them in. They have to be teenagers.
Right.
There was just this small period of time, and I had to figure out how to fit it in. I didn't want to put them in during the Civil War. I didn't want them to be in the Commonwealth. I mean, it was just, I spent years trying to figure out, and then I finally decided wigs was the thing that really did it for me. I was like, no, I don't want them wearing wigs.
Couldn't see that happening, huh?
So then I backed it up. I thought, well, if they're going to be playwrights, what really they should be Elizabethan playwrights. But I did have this thing about Shakespeare. I've never liked Shakespeare because of what he did to Richard III, who was always I was very close to Richard III all my life. So it took something to move me into the late 16th century, but
Well, maybe you can talk a little bit about this, because I know you said that in some ways your friendship, you wrote plays, and you've told me that you were also sort of a Richard III groupie. How did that come about, and how did that play out with your friend? And
yeah. So the Richard III plays a part, well, the play Richard III plays a part in this book. And the play Richard III played a part in my life because when I was quite young, before I even got to high school, I read a book. So literature again is the problem here. I read a book by a writer named Marguerite Vance, who wrote a series of children's books about queens. So she did Lady Jane Grey, and she did Elizabeth Tudor, and she did Elizabeth of Austria. And then she did a book about Richard III. And it was a book in which Richard was portrayed as this gallant, handsome, brave, smart, amazing person. So of course I fell in love with him, right? And then I went to the encyclopedia and looked him up. And you look about, well, at least then they may have changed it because of the Richard III Society. But at that point, if you looked up Richard III, you got deformed, usurper, murderer of his nephews, horrible person. So I had Marguerite Vance on the one side and the encyclopedia on the other side. And I was like, well, I don't believe the encyclopedia. I'm sorry. This is wrong. And so then I discovered the Richard III Society and became a member. And so when I got to high school, I was already a Richard III fanatic. And the way I met my best friend was she was sitting in front of me and I was kicking her desk. And she turned around and was very huffy and was like, stop kicking my desk. And I think, according to her story, the first thing I said to her was, what do you think about Richard III? So, and we did rewrite the Richard III play, the Shakespeare Richard III play. And we did have that line that's in this book, Fall Off Your Horse, is a line from that play. And
also, you told me that she, when you were kicking your chair and you asked about Richard III, that she said something about the Earl of Craven.
Earl of Craven, right? So she said, "Well, I'm related to the Earl of Craven." So the Earl of Craven became another one of the tropes in this book, and that was actually why I started with the 17th century, because the actual Earl of Craven, there is such a person, lived through the whole 17th century, and he had a very interesting life. So I hoped to squeeze them into, but I couldn't get them into the 17th century. So I made up another Craven, another bunch of Cravens.
Yeah.
But there were plenty of, I don't know, as you write a book, it seems as though serendipitous things happen. And so in the search for the Cravens, was this idea of having the Earl of Craven be somewhere in the background of this book, I discovered that there was a place in Yorkshire that is called Craven, and that there is a hill there called the Earl of Craven. So it just became sort of kind of magical in a way.
Yeah. So you capture this, you capture this, I don't know, the thing that I was so attached to in the book of this adolescent, I mean, it is a little love story, that friendship that is so intense as adolescents. You have that, and then you have this whole historical world that you were sort of all wrapped up in as an adolescent. So you and your friend played that out. You wrote plays, you acted in plays,
Yeah. We
And-
wrote plays, we acted in plays. We smoked cigarettes in the park, we did all that stuff. So what I tried to do, which is what I tried to do with Monkey too, is I tried to move as much of the reality, of the details of the reality of our lives from the 20th century to the 16th century. So, and I slipped things in. I slipped in like people who read it and are familiar with the movie Lawrence of Arabia will find that there's a line from Lawrence of Arabia in there. Because the other thing that we did was we saw Lawrence of Arabia about 100 times and we knew the lines to that. So, it's so long as the Irish, it's in Lawrence of Arabia, it's so long as the Arabs fight tribe among tribes, so long will they be a little people, a silly people, greedy, barbarous, and cruel. So that line is in there, but it's about the Irish. So I stuck in things that I thought he would appreciate. But nobody else will get probably. But yeah, I mean, the major story is the friendship, and then the authorship question, the Shakespeare authorship question, which is also very interesting. It's
Well, I'll ask you about that because you said that you had read a book, an article in the Atlantic about, was Shakespeare a woman?
Yeah. Shakespeare was a woman, not
Yeah.
even a person. Shakespeare was a woman by Elizabeth Winkler.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there is, I mean, there has been since the time Shakespeare lived, really, there has been all of this debate and doubt that there actually was a person named William Shakespeare who wrote the plays. So there was always this idea that it was either the Earl of Oxford or Christopher Marlowe or a group of people who were friends of the Countess of Pembroke, who was the sister of Philip Sidney, who had a little writers' colony in her house, in her manor house, which is in the book, my book. So there was always, there were always candidates. Nobody really thought that this uneducated actor named William Shakespeare had written these plays. And so the authorship question was quite interesting. And then I read this article about Amelia Bassano, or Amelia Lanier, depending on what name you use. And Elizabeth Winkler made the argument that she could have been one of the, or she could have been Shakespeare, or she could have been one of the many people who wrote the plays. She has a really interesting background. She was Venetian. She lived in court. She was the mistress of a lord. She spoke several languages.
Yeah.
Possible.
Yeah. And what about also the the sort of multiple authors, the collaborative writing? What's the story behind that?
Well, that's one of that's the idea in this book. Well, it just seemed like, why not have a collective of people write the plays? Why, part of it, I mean, part of the thing about that period is Elizabeth was at the end of her life. She had been very tyrannical all her life. I mean, she was a brutal queen. But at the end of her life, she absolutely refused to even discuss who would succeed her. She had no heir. And people were literally executed for even questioning who was going to succeed her. And there was intense censorship So nobody could even raise the question in writing or talk about it or anything. So what happened was the plays became the medium through which these kinds of questions could be raised
Mhm.
by writing plays that were ahistorical, that had place in the past. So kings that, like Richard II, who, gave up the throne, or the historical plays, including Richard III. So these plays were subversive. We don't really get that so much now because we don't really understand what the situation was, and many of the comedies too, were, they were attacks at the government, but disguised so that some people understood them, some people didn't understand them.
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah.
in the sense that you get a group of people who had ideas about what the government should look like and wanted to work on that project, getting together and writing the plays collectively.
Yeah. So it's a way for them basically to have this sort of subversive conversation in public and protect themselves at the same time, sort of plausible deniability essentially for critics.
So they published under anonymous, or they made up names.
Yeah.
And there's actually a really interesting movie about this called Anonymous, if anybody's interested.
All right. Well, that kind of leads into, I think, the relationship between the history and the fiction, which to me is really interesting because as a historian, you learn that you have to document, obviously at times when you're writing history, it feels like you're making things up because what do you really know? And so as a historian, to kind of make up for that, you cross-reference, you look at multiple different kinds of pieces of evidence, you're kind of held to you have to, you have the footnotes basically to say, this is why I'm making the claim that I'm making about this historical event. Fiction to me seems so free, so what about writing fiction that is historical fiction? Like how much research how close is it to history? How much fictionalization is there? What's the process like for you to do that, to do a historical fiction?
Yeah. So the thing about it is that you can't make factual mistakes. I mean, that's the thing, because you have to create a world that is factual and then place your fictional characters into it.
Yeah.
Because
So maybe give an example.
Hmm?
Maybe you could give an example.
So there's an example of a friend of mine who wrote a book called Audrey Hepburn's Neck, in which the characters were collecting mushrooms at one point, and he made up a mushroom.
Oh.
And all the people, all of his readers who knew about mushrooms, they objected very strongly to this made-up mushroom because it undermines your faith, your faith in the dream that's being created by the fiction writer, which is clearly something that you have to give yourself to. You have to walk into this dream and agree to dream it with the writer.
Yeah.
If the writer makes mistakes, like has the sun rise in the west instead of in the east, I mean, you wonder about all the other things, right? You begin to doubt.
Mhm.
So I spent 3 years doing research and writing notes and figuring out what I was going to do before I started writing. And then when I started writing, I wrote it in like 3 months.
Oh my gosh.
Because I just thought it all out beforehand, and I knew what they wore and I knew what they ate. There's a really, and there were several books that I used consistently. One is a book called The Traveler's Guide to Elizabethan England by Ian Mortimer. And he writes books like Traveler's Guide to the Restoration is another one that I used. And what he does is it's like the sort of the Lonely Planet for another time. So like you land in Elizabethan England. What do you wear? What do you eat? Where do you sleep? What don't you say to people? Do you have to go to church on Sunday? Yes, you do, or else bad things will happen to you. So that's things like that.
Well, I mean, I have to say the detail for me in the clothing is, I mean, it's just great. it gives such a richness to the characters, to the scene. It's like, and the way you write it, it just feels like, I don't know, I could just, you know, have this sensory experience of the clothing. I
Like at
love
one point yeah,
props and the-
the ruffs, and at some point, at one point, Perpetua gets up and she's wearing so many clothes that she almost falls over. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really great. So, okay, so what's, you know, can you kind of flesh out a little bit for everybody, some of the real people and real historical places, events, have figures in the novel versus, and kind of then how you sort of added in the fiction?
Sure. So, so John Taylor, I mean, I don't know if people have read the book or not. There's a character named John Taylor who meets the girls while they're wandering around in the Palatinate, and he brings them to, he's the one who brings them to England. So there really was a John Taylor. He really was a poet and a waterman, and he traveled around and got subscriptions from people to and wrote back travel logs to his friends in England. So he really existed. The group of writers that they fall in with all are real people. So the Countess of Pembroke is there, Christopher Marlowe, the Earl of Essex, the Earl of Oxford. Those are all real people. The Earl of Craven, the one that is, yeah, there is an Earl of Craven, but he doesn't actually appear in the book. When they get to Ireland, the Irish rebels, they're real people. So yeah, there are a lot of real people. And then Verity and Perpetua just wander through that real world that really existed.
Yeah.
Agnes, excuse me for interjecting. This seems like a really good time. So, Kate Carnes had a question, which this might be a fun moment to ask. Is this about you and your friend and who? Well, it's about you and your friend. Are you Verity or Perpetua?
That's a good question. I'm Perpetua, of course. The narrator. Yeah. Yeah, Verity is the creative person. She's the adventurous one. She's the one with all the ideas, and Perpetua just sort of follows after her and kind of adores her, and yeah.
Well, I think their relationship is more complex than that. I mean, you're underselling Perpetua just a little bit.
Perpetua is not really me, and Verity is not really my friend. They're just, yeah.
But okay, so but it's interesting because so Verity and Perpetua are these characters that you've inserted then into this historical reality, but you're also kind of playing around with some of the real people, like, you know, the Christopher Marlowe character. You do some funny things with him. You do some, you know, so maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
So, and this is very interesting and also kind of serendipitous. There's an organization called Shakespeare Authorship Trust, the Shakespeare Authorship Trust, which I discovered after I wrote the book, totally accidentally. And they have on their website, they have a gallery of the possible candidates to be Shakespeare, little portraits, right? And they have this little portrait of Christopher Marlowe. And so I clicked on it to see what they had to say about Christopher Marlowe. Now, in the book, I have Christopher Marlowe not die, because I never liked the idea that Christopher Marlowe died, especially the way he did.
So you could flesh that out, because there might not be people that know how he died.
Marlowe officially died in a bar fight at the age of 29 by being stabbed in the eye. And in a bar fight, Christopher Marlowe in a bar fight. So I never bought that. I never bought that. I was like, no. And especially because, you know, there was no inquest. There was, you know, it was foggy. Nothing was done properly about Christopher Marlowe's death. And a lot of people did want him dead because he was a troublemaker. Anyway, So in the book, I have him not die. And I could actually read that section if we have time and if you want me to.
Yeah.
So I'm at the website looking up Christopher Marlowe, and this was just the other day. And then there was this whole thing about how there was actually this theory that Christopher Marlowe had not been killed in that bar fight. That in fact it was after his supposed death that the so-called Shakespeare plays started rolling out at a regular basis, and you get all the really great plays after that. And you also have lines from Christopher Marlowe's other plays inserted into Shakespeare's plays.
Mm-hmm.
Like the line that no one loves except, no, there is no, well, the line about first sight, love at first sight, that line is inserted in, it's a Christopher Marlowe line, it's inserted in one of the comedies, and it's used to show that Shakespeare really admired Christopher Marlowe, and I think, no, it shows that Christopher Marlowe actually wrote the play.
That's great. But so you have these characters. I mean, so you have Marlowe, you have the Sevilles,
Yeah,
you
Harry Saville, yeah.
know, so and you've done the research, so you know they're real people, but you're also, you know, you're fictionalizing their interactions with your characters.
Mhm.
You're and
Right.
so
Yeah, I
did
kidnapped
you like that's just you're kind of inhabiting that person? How does that happen for you? Like for me, I would have to go and like do all the research and figure out like, did that person really sound like that? I would, you know, I'd be very, you know, nervous about misstepping. Did you have any of that, or did you just feel like,
I
okay,
feel no guilt.
qualm.
No, I just grab them. I don't, yeah, no guilt. I apologize as I'm doing it. I'm very sorry. But you know, Christopher Marlowe gets laid in this book. I don't see how he has nothing to complain about. He doesn't die. He
It's true.
doesn't die. He lives.
Yeah. So you elevate Christopher Marlowe. What about your feelings about? I mean, you have a lot of Shakespeare references in here.
Oh, yes. I really enjoyed just using Shakespeare heartlessly.
Yeah. So maybe you can talk a little about that, because you said you hated Shakespeare earlier.
I hate Shakespeare. Or I hate whoever wrote Richard III. Okay, so the fun part of this for me was rewriting Richard III as a farce. Because I think it is. I mean, I think if you read Richard III, especially the beginning of Richard III, the wooing scene, which I have them write it. So the wooing scene of Richard III was written by Perpetua and Verity, as a farce, right? I mean, there he is. I don't know if people remember the Richard III, but you know, he's all deformed and horrible, and he's trying to court this Anne, who becomes his wife, and he's just murdered her husband. And there's the corpse of the father-in-law, and he gets her to agree to marry him. It's ridiculous. It's totally ridiculous, right? It's a laugh. So they write it as a farce. You know, their job was to write it as a farce. But at the end of while they're talking about it, one of them says, you know, would anyone take this seriously? And Perpetua says, oh, don't be daft. Nobody would take this seriously. But in fact, people have taken it seriously. So that's why I hate Shakespeare. I mean, he's very responsible for what people think about Richard, which is ridiculous. It's pure propaganda, pure, absolute propaganda.
Yeah. But you have a lot of Shakespeare references in here. So clearly you're not a, you know, I mean, maybe you could talk a little bit, I mean, for people about sort of all of the plays that you are playing on in your.
I'm playing on. Yeah. Well, As You Like It is the main one. And Richard and The Tempest is mentioned, and Merchant of Venice. I have Amelia Bassano write the Merchant of Venice.
Yeah.
Because she's from Venice.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So do you think did you find that there was too much Shakespeare, that you couldn't tell what was Shakespeare and what was Verity and Perpetua?
Well, that's interesting to me is, you know, the line, it's blurred, you know, so the rhyming scene that we started out with, you know.
Some of it's him and some of it's me.
Right.
Yeah.
And So I'm well, first of all, I'm awestruck at the writing of it because it's just it's so clever and it's so joyful. So, to be able to read it is such a fun book to read because of that. And I felt like I was getting re-educated about, my Shakespeare while also just really enjoying it. So, I'm just does it just come to you? I mean, like, how do you write that?
I don't know. I don't know. Well, one of the things I had to do once I decided that it was going to be Shakespeare, that it was going to be late 16th century and not Restoration, is that I read all the plays, which I had never done in my life because I hated Shakespeare so much.
Okay.
So I read them all. And if you read them all, it's amazing because there really are only like two plots that keep repeating themselves over and over and over again. And some of them are very misogynistic in some of the plays. I mean, but then there's some lines that are just amazing and some scenes that are so amazing. So you wonder like, okay, so there's a lot of variation here between good
Yeah.
plays, bad plays, good lines, bad lines. So when I sat down to write after doing all of that reading and all of that research, and I felt like I had to write it because my head was blown, it was like, oh, I have to write it now. It just seemed like I had incorporated so much of the rhythm of the verse, the sound of it, which Christopher Marlowe says he created blank verse, right? Um,
Okay.
so that iambic, I just felt like it just, you know, and I was like, okay, anybody could write these plays. I can do it. It can be done. Yeah, so I felt like I was channeling
Yeah.
with the plays. I was just channeling them.
Yeah. That's really great. I
Fun.
mean,
I
it
had
makes,
fun. I had a lot of fun writing this book. I
well,
hope it's obvious when you read it.
it
I
is.
laughed through a whole lot of this book.
Yeah. And there is a line in this book that I literally laughed out loud at, which is, I have to give it away.
Yeah,
The
what is it?
take a spear at.
Oh, Shakespeare.
Yes,
How they decided what to call themselves.
yes,
Shakespeare.
yeah, which is just, brilliant. But okay, so the other thing I want to talk a little bit about is sort of the issues that you're addressing of your friendship and how they mesh with the Elizabethan era. I mean, when I would teach history, my students would often come into the classroom and they're sort of the way in which they imagine people in the past is, I think, pretty one-dimensional. They kind of can't imagine that people in the past would maybe be debating things like gender identity or, I think they think, oh, it's the past, and so we're way more advanced now.
We're way more advanced.
Right. So, I mean, Verity and Perpetua address a lot of issues, gender identity, women's rights, uh, you know, government, the republic versus tyranny, religious oppression. Yeah, I mean, I think you probably can add even more to the list. And so, you know, how much of that is, I mean, do you feel that that's a true view or an accurate view of some of the debates that are going on in the Elizabethan era?
Yeah, yeah.
So maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Sure. I mean, well, okay, um, so I'm a secular humanist, and I also believe in literature, and I believe in the power of literature to transmit um, thought and experience from one generation to another, right? That's how our culture lives. It survives by one generation passing on that knowledge and those ideas and those experiences to the next through literature. So as long as you have some writing, as long as you have writing, you have access to other people's minds. And since we have an enormous amount of writing from the Renaissance, I mean, we have writing from the Greeks as well. You can just read. I mean, you can read pamphlets that were published by women once the printing press became available and censorship laws were changed under the Stuarts. The women were writing amazing, not only like flyers, like pamphlets, I guess they were called pamphlets, on gender equality, like the rights of women, the Parliament of Women. This was a play that was written in the 1630s, I think, which was, it was supposed to be like a comedy, like Lysistrata, but it
Right.
wasn't, because the idea of a Parliament of Women was out there in the public realm because it was a play that was produced and written by a woman. So there was all this literature that shows that this is something that people were talking about. And then you also have the fact that there were women who dressed as men, who fought in the armies, well, you have Elizabeth, it's a queen. So you have a government that's run by a woman. So I think all of those questions were, I mean, I know that all of those questions were being discussed, were being taught, were being navigated. Sexual identity, I mean, they didn't call it that. I mean, there was homosexuality. People didn't call it homosexuality. There wasn't a word for that. I mean, didn't use that word. But all you have to do really is look at some of the books that were used by confessors, the confessionals, right? All of the list of things that the priest would ask in confession, like, have you sodomized your wife? Have you sodomized? And it's like, yeah. So, yeah, and you've got Chaucer. I mean, so I think it's just really clear that as long as we have as evidence, written literature, then we have access to people's ideas and thoughts and experiences, and everybody is the same. We're all the same.
Yeah. But in terms of I mean, what strikes me is, right now we're trying to police gender identity. You're a biological man or you're a biological woman.
Mhm.
And it seems like, we are very, very, very concerned about maintaining those very strict boundaries. And I'm just wondering, like, do you think in the Elizabethan era, yes, Elizabeth is the queen. Male actors dress as females to play in plays. Women are dressing as men to fight in wars or go out into the public square. Is
Or
there?
to run businesses. There were a lot of women who ran public houses, and they dressed as men. I mean,
And
So
so do you
yeah, I don't
think they were, were the boundary, was there still this like intense desire to maintain the boundaries? I mean, for example, with Elizabeth, did she have to perform femininity in any way? Do you think?
I don't know. She did dye her hair. Yeah, I
Okay.
think I'm not.
I mean, it's interesting because I think your book raises those questions about how much could women, sort of challenge the boundaries of a male world? How much could they challenge the boundaries of religious oppression? How much could they, challenge the boundaries of a tyrannical government?
So I think that in the book, what I did was I asked that question and answer it in a very conservative way by having the Savile family, the women of the Savile family, have the freedom within their house to do experiments, all kinds of mechanical experiments and artistic work and this incredible library, because the outside world was being run in a very tyrannical and repressive way. And so if the outside world is repressive, and it was extremely repressive, now not necessarily in the way that around gender, but certainly around other political statements and religious statements. I mean, if you were a Catholic in Elizabethan England, you were in deep trouble already, just to start with.
Mhm.
And the church, now England was different and always different and wasn't as oppressive as other countries. But in Europe, you know, if you were guilty of a homosexual act, you got burnt at the stake. I mean, it was no fun.
Yeah.
So I would say that, again, just as we have all of these issues and all of this underlying oppressive attachments to our defined genders and our defined sexuality, they had it the same thing, and they were fighting the same kind of fight to liberate people from that. It's it's the human condition. Like, we're always trying to break boundaries, and we're always being pushed back again, and try to break boundaries and being pushed back. And so Elizabethan England is so interesting because of that, because the leader was a woman. There was a lot more ability for women to do things, but at the same time, they couldn't publish plays. They couldn't act on the stage. I mean, there were all kinds of repressive boundaries that were only broken later on after the Civil War. It's such an interesting question, though.
Yeah. I mean, I think,
do we advance or not?
right. Do
Are
we
we
advance?
advancing, or are we just staying the same, and the same things happen over and over and over again?
Yeah.
May I interject a question at this point? We have a couple in the, actually Nicole Detremont has a question. Why did you decide to place it in the Elizabethan world and not the 1950s? We're talking about oppression. I think it's an interesting place to interject this question, because you could have done the 1950s as a setting and had, like, similar themes move through. Why Elizabethan England?
Because I wanted to move it to another century altogether. I didn't want it in the 20th century at all, because I wanted to be able to take the things about our relationship that I thought were more kind of universal, and strip away all of the things that could be more autobiographical. So if I'd said it in the 50s, I was alive in the 50s, and I didn't, I wanted it to be in a place where I myself did not exist before I existed. And I wanted it to be in a place where these two characters I could sort of start, I mean, they start off not remembering anything. And I think that's really important. They have no memory of their former life, of their childhood. They've been orphaned, they're in a convent. So they start with each other from scratch. And so I didn't want it to have anything to do with America or the contemporary world. I wanted it to be in a totally different world, a sort of a place where a reader could be more, where everything could be dreamier, where the whole story could take place as a sort of almost like a fairy tale. The children lost in the woods kind of thing.
Thank you for that, Agnes. I have one more question, and then we have about 10 more minutes, Peggy, and I'll let you finish up the night. Jillian would like to know, has your counterpart read the book yet? Verity, I would guess.
Oh, yes, she has. Of course, I wouldn't have published it without having her read it first, because it's so obviously about her and me. And so, yeah, she said it was like revisiting our childhood, which in fact it is. So she was right. Yeah.
Just a follow-up to that, I think, is, the question about you moving it from the 1950s. I do think it does take on this sort of Shakespeare, well, going out into the forest, or the sort of magical component of the friendship. It makes it so much, it really captures the beauty, I think, of that very idealistic adolescent friendship, where your friend is everything, and you're creating your lives anew, and you're imagining these possibilities for yourselves, and you're finding love, and you're experimenting with love, and you're feeling like your heart is broken, and then you're feeling like your heart is going to explode. It's like your book really captures all that. So yeah.
Yeah, and I think also, you know, they're clearly like in love with each other. They just don't know that they're in love with each other.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's, you know, and so, and then there's that funny Christopher Marlowe scene again.
Yeah.
But
But maybe you can read some of that.
if we have enough time, we might not have enough time for
No, we
that.
have enough time.
Yeah.
Just a little bit of this Christopher Marlowe scene. Because they've just, you know, they've just had this thing happen. And they're in the woods. And so he says, you're something quite other. Everyone here has a secret, but yours is the most interesting one of all. Because she's been dressing as a boy, and he suddenly realized that he suddenly realized that he's a girl, that she's a girl. So that was the secret that he's referring to. Except for mine, of course. He had put his cloak around us both, so we were nestled close together and whispering like children do in their beds at night. It came to me then suddenly, a memory of being a child in a bed with another child, whispering in the dark. Oh, it came like a bird into my mind. It flew in, alighted, turned its head this way and that, and then flew away and left only a memory of a memory behind. And he was saying something in Latin, which I only heard a small piece of as I was contemplating the flight of the oracular bird by which one can read the future and the past. Repeat, please, I said in that same tongue, slowly. I was murdered several months ago in a tavern in London. I am dead. The word sent a shiver through me, I will admit, but his body beside me was so warm. His own head was leaning upon mine. One of his ringlets was tickling my cheek, and I could feel his breath as he spoke. You are as live as I am, I said. If you are dead, so am I. That's my girl, he said and laughed. Or should I say boy? Or should I say angel, who we know are of no determinate sex? And then he goes on and explains how he got killed and how he pretended to die and how they switched bodies and la 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 la. But it's that whole thing about, because she is very androgynous. She dresses as a boy. She has a male name. She's always looking at Verity, and Verity's like, where's the, you know, like the doublet, and she's very slim, and Perpetua's always going, oh, Verity's looking really good in green.
Yeah.
I have a comment from Joe I'd like to read. What drives the book is the friendship between Verity and Perpetua. Their dialogues are dialogues of Agnes's inner life. I hear Agnes in everything they say. Read this way, it becomes a psychological thriller in addition to everything else. P.S. Why do fairy tales feature orphans so often?
Yeah, Bruno Bettelheim talks about that, I think, about why fairy tales have orphans in them, but I can't remember what he said. Do you remember, Peggy? Why do fairy tales have orphans in them all the time?
Well, I mean, in some ways you said it when you were talking about create, you know, imagining their story. They come from nothing. And so it's very Lockean in some ways. It's like, okay, it's a blank slate.
Yeah.
And it's going out into nature, the world, and
And
being
you can believe anything you want about yourself.
yes, you create
You can
yourself.
believe that you're the son of the or the daughter of the king, because
Yeah.
you may be.
Yeah.
Possible. Yeah.
So, are there other questions or things that we haven't talked about? Things that I haven't asked you, Agnes, that you want to tell?
No.
Eleanor Morse has a question. Her hand is raised. Eleanor, would you like to unmute?
Yeah, hi, am I talking now?
Hi, Eleanor.
Hi, hi, Agnes. Hi, Peggy.
Hi.
So I was thinking, Agnes, about one of the things that I love and admire about all the books that you've written is the flexibility of tone. What I mean is from one book to another, there's a huge range of possibilities. Like Monkey is so different from the Oracle Pool, which is so different from this rollicking book that you've just finished writing. And I'm just, well, I admire that flexibility. And I'm also wondering, you and Peggy have been talking about how you explore the history of a time and how you happen to set a book in a particular history or historical period. But I'm also curious about how the tone comes about for each book, and whether it comes naturally from the characters that that Verity and Perpetua are fun-loving, adventurous young women. So does the tone evolve from that, or do you in the beginning of a process of writing sort of think want to write a more exuberant book this time? Or does it happen kind of simultaneously? How does it happen for you?
Well, for me, like Monkey was just such an intense experience because it was about, I mean, I don't know if people who don't know the book, my son had died and I wanted to write about him, and it was just really hard to write the book, and I couldn't stop writing it once I started it, and it was a Russian novel, so it had a sort of lugubrious tone, because it was a Russian novel. So it did have some funny parts. But I basically I personally like books that are funny and that, I mean, not funny, but that have exuberance, that have joy in them. And it seemed after Monkey, if I was going to write anything else, because I thought for a while I thought that's it, I've done it. This is the last book. But I really, as I said, I really wanted to write about my friend, and I really wanted to write a book that was playful. So I think that that's the thing. I decided I'm going to write a playful book. It's not going to be serious. It's not going to be sad. Nobody's going to die. It's going to be a fun book to write and a fun book to read. And that was how I decided to do it.
Yeah, and you did do it.
Yeah.
But I'm really so admiring of, if I look at your books over the years, and there's a prodigious number of wonderful books. But there's such a variation in width of tone, and not only historical dimensions, but the I mean, it's almost like different dances, a Renaissance gavotte or a samba or a street, a street dance. There's that kind of variation. So it's wonderful that you're able to do that.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's fun to do it. And it's also, a lot of it depends on what the subject of the book is, right? So if I'm writing about some very serious thing, like Local Deities, which was about domestic terrorists and people on the FBI most wanted list, and children being abandoned, and court cases and whatnot, that there's a seriousness about that. Or Days of the Dead, which was about the Nicaraguan Revolution, there's seriousness about that. But in other books, it's possible to bring in characters who have a different take on the world and who find the world amusing, And so sometimes I'll write a book in which everybody's very serious, and I'll think, it's very, very heavy. Everything's very heavy. I need to try to make things lighter. So
Yeah.
this book was particularly light, though, I think. There's very little in here that's heavy. Every once in a while, something happens that's a little. The background to it is dark. There are people being executed and people being persecuted, but they meander around that. they jump out of the way of the war. When they hear the war coming, they climb a tree or something, right? They can get away with it. So I wanted that to be the case because I wanted them to have a fun time.
Thank you.
Other questions from people out there that I haven't asked? I think it's really a pleasure to be able to talk to you because you're so able to sort of explain the writing process and you know, I think often it's that can be very hidden when you're reading a book, that you just all these questions can arise, and to have somebody be able to kind of unpack and say, well, this is how this happened, and here's how this is
Where that line came from.
came about, and here's the things that influenced me, and here's what I'm thinking about. So I really enjoyed being able to publicly engage with you around these questions.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just looking, I just opened it at random and there's this thing about them playing card games. And I'm thinking Maw, the game of Maw. I had to figure, I was like, well, what are they going to do in the evening? They'll play cards. Did they play cards in the 16th century? Then I had to check it out. And what did they play? And how did and how does that work? And how many people are there playing at once? And do you gamble or? So it's fun. It's like you learn stuff, right? When you
Yeah.
being a historian is a fun thing.
Well, I think it seems, from my perspective, it seems more fun to write historical fiction in a sense. Maybe that's just me wishing that, I wasn't traumatized in graduate school or something, but it's, the leeway of being able to imagine sort of the real emotional depth of interactions between people, which history, when you're writing it, usually turns into more of you're making an argument about, you're arguing with other historians about some particular set of issues, and then it's all got to be documented, and so all that, sometimes that playfulness goes away in the there's not much room for it. Academic writing can be very, I don't know, confined, I guess. And the fiction, I think, allows you to have fun doing the research and then sort of imagining this moment in the past while also embodying it, literally trying to embody it and live it. So
Plug my computer in because it wants to be. Come on, where are you? There. It was going to go off. It was like, give me more energy. Give me more energy.
Agnes, we have a question from Jillian. Do you ever wish novelists had writers' rooms like the one Verity and Perpetua contributed to?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question.
Do you ever wish novelists had writers' rooms like the one Verity and Perpetua contributed to? Jillian, if you want to expand on that or explain it, you're welcome to unmute.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hey, Agnes.
Hi, Julian.
Oh, they have such a wonderful little sojourn at the Manor House, all jamming together on these plays.
Oh,
And
yeah.
was wondering if that was a little wish
Oh, yeah.
fulfillment for you.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, especially with that bunch of people, that particular bunch of people. You hang out with the Countess of Pembroke. It's like and Amelia Bassano and the astrologer come by. Yeah, of course. Of course it was fun. And wandering in the woods. And she did have such a place. It was called Wilton House, and it still exists. You can go visit it. And she did invite writers to come, and it was sort of like a writers' colony, an Elizabethan writers' colony. That's what I would have really liked. I think that would have been really, really fun.
could you imagine collaboratively writing something with a group of people?
Yeah, I mean, my friend and I we always collaborated on plays. I could not collaborate on a novel, I don't think, but a play for sure.
Maybe that's your next project.
Maybe. You want to collaborate on play?
Maybe.
there-
Then the actors come in and from Carl. Oh, thanks for being here, Carl.
If there are no other questions from the group, I think maybe we can start tying things up. Peggy, do you have any other questions for Agnes you'd like to follow up?
Well, my biggest question is, what's the next book?
Oh, yeah, I don't know. Ask me in a couple of years.
Okay.
I have to.
I know. Are you researching anything? Have
No,
any characters visited you?
waiting for things. I'm waiting for something to hit me.
Okay.
No, I don't know. Afroban maybe? No, I don't think so. Afroban is really an interesting person though. She's worth exploring, but not by me. Somebody else can do it. She's an interesting person. She wrote a play called Orinoco, which was or the Royal Slave, and it was
Yeah.
you know this play? Set
Heard
in
of it.
Caribbean, and it's about slavery. It was it was like one of the first anti-slavery works produced. And she was pretty amazing.
Okay. Well,
But there you are.
yes.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you, Peggy, for being such a wonderful host tonight. And of course, thank you, Agnes. You can buy Verity and Perpetua at literalbooks.com. And join us again next month for the next Literally Alive. Check the website, and if you haven't signed up for our email, sign up for our email to get the news. So thank you. Any last words, Agnes?
Thanks everybody for coming and for great questions. And I hope you enjoy reading the book. And yeah, have a good month.
And
Until
thanks for inviting me. I appreciate it. It was really fun.
It was great.